The courtroom was quiet, cold, and sterile, like a place that had forgotten how to feel. The air hung heavy, as if it were holding its breath. When the side door creaked open and two bailiffs escorted the defendant in, no one looked up, just another case, another lost soul, another name on the docket. But then he stepped into the light. His hands were cuffed, wrists stiff beneath iron restraints. His face was dark, not just in skin but in shadow, a map of lines and weathered edges that spoke of years spent in places most people wouldn't dare imagine. His coat hung loose on his thin frame, an old military-issue jacket 2 sizes too big, with threads fraying at the sleeves and a faded patch barely visible near his heart. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. He kept his gaze down, like the ground was the only thing left that hadn't judged him. The clerk cleared her throat. "State your name, sir." The man looked up slowly. His eyes, a deep shade of brown, seemed to carry the weight of wars. His voice cracked like dry wood when he answered, low and trembling but still firm. "Ludicrous. Staff Sergeant, United States Marines." A few heads turned. Not many. Just enough to feel the subtle shift in the room. It was the way he said it, not as if announcing who he was, but remembering who he used to be. On the bench, Judge Olivia Parker sat upright, flipping through the manila folder that had just been handed to her. Her robe hung perfectly pressed, her silver-rimmed glasses perched delicately on her nose. She read quietly at first, but then paused mid-page. Her lips parted slightly, her hand freezing above the paper. She read the name again. Ludicrous. Her face paled, just a shade, but in that moment something changed behind her eyes. Something old had stirred. Her fingers tightened around the folder's edge. Across the courtroom, Ludicrous sat hunched on the bench, his shoulders swallowed in the oversized coat, a ghost of the man he once was. He didn't notice her reaction. He didn't notice anything, really. He looked like a man who had learned that being invisible was safer. Case 47B, the bailiff called. City of Newbridge vs. Ludicrous. Charges, disturbing the peace, trespassing, resisting arrest. Ludicrous stood with effort, joints popping in silent protest. He moved like a man who'd been worn down by more than just time. Vietnam first. Then Iraq. Wounds visible and hidden, carried in silence across decades. The prosecutor, young and sharply dressed in a tailored gray suit, approached the lectern. He spoke with the polished tone of someone who had never missed a meal or slept on concrete. "Your Honor, the defendant has been warned repeatedly about loitering behind the Jefferson Street Cafe. The establishment filed 3 complaints this month alone." He paused for effect, as if waiting for a nod of approval. "What the prosecution fails to mention," he continued, "is that the defendant never begged for food, never asked for handouts. He simply sat near the back alley vent, where the heat from the kitchen helped him survive the coldest nights." There was a brief silence. The prosecutor went on. At 11:45 p.m., the defendant was found behind the cafe. He refused to vacate the premises when ordered by Officer Ramsey. This is his 3rd citation this year. The city recommends 30 days of community service and a no trespass order for the downtown district. Judge Parker looked up from the file, her eyes searching Ludicrous's face. "Mr. Ludicrous," she said evenly, "do you have legal representation today?" He shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. "No, ma'am." Public defender got pulled into another courtroom. "Would you like to speak on your own behalf?" she asked. His throat moved as he swallowed. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and small. "No excuses, ma'am. Just needed to stay warm." "Why that location?" Her tone sharpened, but her expression remained unreadable. Ludicrous hesitated. "Jimmy. The cook. He leaves food out sometimes. Known him since he was a kid. His daddy served with me. Desert Storm." A flicker crossed her face. She asked, gently but directly, "And your service?" He straightened, just slightly. United States Marine Corps. 1975 to 95. Staff Sergeant. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Iraq. His words landed like stone on water, small but deep, rippling quietly through the courtroom. Judge Parker made a quick note in the file, but her pen slowed midway. There was something else, something further in his record, something that didn't add up. Before she could speak again, the courtroom doors opened. The sound of polished shoes echoed on the floor. A man in a navy blue suit walked briskly to the defense table, briefcase in hand. His hair was silver at the temples, his demeanor controlled, almost effortless. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "Alexander Ross. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Ludacris. Apologies for the abrupt entrance." Ludacris blinked. He hadn't called a lawyer. Certainly not one who wore cufflinks and Italian leather. "This is highly irregular," Judge Parker said, eyeing the man. "The court wasn't notified of any new counsel." "It was a last-minute development," Ross replied. "I respectfully request a brief recess to speak with my client." Parker studied them both, her lips tight. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, she said, standing and exiting the bench. Ludacris turned toward the stranger beside him, suspicion plain on his face. "I can't pay you," he muttered. "You won't need to," Ross replied quietly. "My firm, Williams, Ross, and Parker, is taking this pro bono." Ludacris furrowed his brow. "Parker." "Exactly like the judge," Ross said. And then, as if that name alone meant more than it seemed, he opened his briefcase. In that moment, Ludacris had no idea his world was about to shift. No idea that fate, war, memory, and justice had converged in this one courtroom. No idea that someone had remembered his name, and everything it once stood for. And across the room, behind Chambers' doors, Judge Olivia Parker sat staring at an old photo of her brother in uniform, a younger version of herself beside him, beaming with pride. Next to it lay a letter, written from Iraq, the final words of a Marine who would never return. A name scrawled in ink across the lines: "Staff Sergeant Ludacris saved my life." She whispered aloud, "It can't be him, but what if it is?" The past had just walked through her courtroom door, and it refused to be forgotten. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Long before the courtroom, long before the streets, there was fire. Not just the fire of bullets or bombs, but the fire inside a man who believed in something: honor, country, brothers. Ludacris had once stood taller than most, his chest broad beneath the weight of a flak jacket, his hand steady on the grip of his rifle. The deserts of Iraq were hot and blinding, but back then, he had clarity. Purpose. Orders. And most importantly, Marines at his back. He didn't wake up homeless. He didn't start out broken. The war had carved that into him piece by piece. In 2004, Fallujah was nothing but chaos wrapped in concrete. Streets twisted like serpents, each corner a gamble. Ludacris had been deployed there with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, urban combat at its most brutal. Door to door, street to street, a ghost town littered with ambushes and whispers of death. His unit was tasked with securing a supply convoy coming through the western edge. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance. Intelligence had lied. They had rolled in at dawn, the sun bleeding orange through the dust clouds, when the first RPG screamed overhead. The lead vehicle was obliterated in seconds, fire tearing through metal like paper. Chaos erupted, gunfire from rooftops, windows, and alleys. The Marines scrambled for cover, some never making it off their transports. Ludacris had shouted commands over the radio, trying to organize the retreat, but communications jammed almost instantly. It was instinct then. Training. Gut. He remembered the screams. Not of fear, but pain. A medic had gone down trying to reach a wounded corporal, and another Marine, young, eager, barely 20, rushed into the open. That Marine was Lieutenant Jack Parker. He was too new to know better, too brave to stop. He got the medic behind a wall, but caught a round in the shoulder. Ludacris had seen him drop, saw the blood bloom across his sleeve. And he ran. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't even choice. It was muscle memory, the kind drilled into every Marine. No man left behind. Not while he still breathed. Ludacris had moved through the open street, fire kicking up dirt around his boots, his rifle swinging with purpose. He found Jack groaning, trying to crawl, still shouting for help for the others. "Leave me!" Jack had yelled, voice strained with pain. "Go! Help them instead!" But Ludacris didn't leave anyone. He hoisted the officer over his shoulder, staggered behind a burned-out car, returned fire long enough for the others to regroup. He'd taken 2 rounds in the thigh and 1 through the side of his vest. By the time the medevac bird landed, Ludacris was barely conscious, the lieutenant's blood soaked into his uniform along with his own. That was the last he remembered of Fallujah. When he woke up in the green-hued sterility of a field hospital in Germany, he was told he'd saved 6 men. That Parker was alive. That he'd be awarded the Silver Star. But they also said he wasn't going back, not this time. His TBI from an earlier blast had worsened. He was pulled from active combat, reassigned, then eventually discharged. The years afterward were a blur of half-starts. His wife left while he was still in rehab. The government paperwork got lost. VA appointments were backlogged, then denied. He worked construction for a while, until the pain made it impossible. The night terrors came next. Loud sounds in alleyways. Flashbacks in crowds. Once, a boy on a skateboard made a loud bang and Ludacris dove behind a dumpster, shaking and whispering coordinates to Marines who no longer existed. The world didn't see Staff Sergeant Ludacris. It saw a black man talking to himself behind a trash bin. The medals were gone, sold, lost, forgotten. The stories faded with time. And slowly, Ludacris faded with them. He stopped correcting people who called him a bum. He stopped explaining that he'd once led men into battle. He just tried to survive. One hot meal here. One dry alley there. Jimmy, the cook at the Jefferson Street Cafe, became the only thread of kindness left in his days. Jimmy had grown up hearing stories about Ludacris from his father, another Marine. Every so often, Jimmy would pass off a sandwich or a cup of hot soup out the back door without a word. But the city didn't care about sandwiches or quiet gratitude. The complaints kept coming. The police followed orders. Ludacris didn't fight back when they cuffed him. He didn't raise his voice when they accused him. He had stopped trying to be understood a long time ago. And now, in a courtroom filled with unfamiliar eyes, he stood again, not as a soldier, not even as a man with a name, but as a case number, a nuisance. Only this time, something was different. The judge. The lawyer who showed up without being asked. The way his name had made the air freeze. Ludacris didn't yet understand what had shifted, but something in the room had changed the moment he spoke his name aloud. Something ancient had stirred. He thought back to the words Jack Parker had gasped in his ear as Ludacris carried him through the bullets, "Don't let me be forgotten." At the time, Ludacris had answered without hesitation, "Not on my watch, Lieutenant." He had kept that promise. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet see, was that someone else had been trying to keep that promise too. Someone who had never forgotten the man who carried her brother from the fire. And that someone now wore a black robe, sat behind a polished bench, and had just felt her past reach out from 20 years ago to shake her soul. In that courtroom, the war wasn't over. It had simply taken a new form. The battle now was for dignity, for memory, for justice long delayed. Ludacris didn't yet know it, but the next time he stood, it wouldn't be as a defendant. It would be as a Marine. And for the first time in years, the world would be forced to see him not as broken, not as invisible, but as the man he truly was. The man who never left anyone behind. And maybe, just maybe, someone was finally coming back for him. The coat had once been crisp, dark olive green with brass buttons that caught sunlight like stars. It had belonged to a younger Ludacris, one who stood with his platoon in formation as the national anthem rang out, who wore his stripes with pride and his mission like a second skin. Now, it sagged from his shoulders like the weight of all he'd lost, the fabric threadbare and faded, sleeves frayed at the cuffs, collar torn where rank once gleamed. But he wore it still, every day, not just for warmth but as a final tether to the man he used to be. Most people didn't notice him. They passed by like wind, eyes straight ahead, lips pressed thin. Sometimes a parent pulled their child a little closer as they walked past the alley where he sat, as if his stillness might suddenly erupt into danger. Ludacris never begged. Not once. He didn't ask for coins or pity. He simply stayed close to the vent behind the Jefferson Street Cafe where warm air hissed out into the cold. Winter in Newbridge was a brutal thing. The snow didn't care if you had medals or memories. It buried everything, especially the forgotten. Jimmy, the cook, never made a big deal out of it. He was a wiry man in his early 30s with tattoos crawling up one arm and the kind of tired eyes you'd expect on someone twice his age. Each night, just after closing, Jimmy stepped into the back alley and left something on the cinder block near the vent. Sometimes a sandwich wrapped in foil, sometimes a plastic bowl of stew with a napkin folded neatly underneath. He never said much, just a quick nod before slipping back inside. Ludacris appreciated the silence. It reminded him of the way his brothers-in-arms communicated on patrol, no wasted words, only meaning. Jimmy's quiet kindness was the only light in a world that had grown dark and cold. But not everyone shared Jimmy's compassion. The cafe's owner, Mr. Chalmers, a man with slicked back hair and the permanent scowl of someone who'd never missed a mortgage payment, had made it clear Ludacris wasn't welcome. He called the police. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in 1 month. He claimed the alley behind his restaurant wasn't a shelter. He didn't want vagrants lowering the aesthetic of his upscale cafe. The officers came on a Tuesday night. The wind was brutal, the kind that bit through clothes and skin. Ludacris sat tucked into the corner of the alley, chewing slowly through half a sandwich Jimmy had left, roast beef and cheddar. He hadn't even finished when the cruiser pulled up. Flashlights pinned him in place, bright and unrelenting. "Sir, you need to move along," Officer Ramsey said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Just 5 more minutes," Ludacris answered softly, lifting the sandwich slightly as if that explained everything. "You've been warned before. I'm not bothering anyone. Just trying to stay warm." But that didn't matter. Rules were rules, and the man writing them didn't wear a coat full of memories. Ramsey cuffed him, not roughly but without sympathy, and loaded him into the back of the cruiser. Ludacris didn't resist. Resistance hadn't worked in the past, and besides, his knees were stiff and aching. He sat in silence, watching the city pass through the fogged glass window as if it belonged to another world. The booking process was routine. Fingerprints, mug shot, personal items, though Ludacris had none but the coat. An officer eyed it before placing it in a plastic bin. "You want to hold on to this?" the officer asked, almost as an afterthought. Ludacris just nodded. He didn't say what the coat meant. He didn't say that it had once been his armor, that it had witnessed death and courage and laughter in the worst places on earth. That it was the last thing he had left that told the truth about who he was. They put him in a holding cell for the night. Concrete floor. Fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. He tried to sleep but the chill in the room crept into his bones. He pulled the coat around him tighter, rested his back against the wall, and shut his eyes. He dreamed of sand. Not the cold concrete but the burning desert. Fallujah again. Only this time, no gunfire, no blood. Just the endless wind sweeping over ruined buildings and the sound of voices he hadn't heard in years. He saw Jack Parker again, standing tall, laughing like he used to before the firefight. Ludacris reached out in the dream, tried to speak, but the wind swallowed his words. He woke up to a harsh clang, the cell door opening. A bailiff stood there with a clipboard. "Time to go, Sergeant." The word hit harder than expected. It had been years since someone called him that. He rose slowly, joints creaking, coat slung over one shoulder. They led him into the courtroom and sat him on the defendant's bench, where his journey would take a sharp turn he hadn't foreseen. Ludacris didn't expect sympathy. He expected a lecture, maybe community service, maybe 30 days in the holding facility. But when the judge said his name and looked at him, not through him, he felt something shift. She wasn't just reading a file. She was remembering something. Someone. Her eyes trembled for just a second. Then she caught herself. The courtroom settled. The clerk called the case. And Ludacris, dressed in the only thing that still connected him to his past, stood to face judgment. It was just another Tuesday in a world that had long stopped caring. But for the first time in decades, someone had heard his name and paused. The soldier in the worn-out coat was not just another case anymore. Someone was starting to see the man inside the uniform again. And that was the first step towards something Ludacris had stopped believing in long ago: redemption. Judge Olivia Parker had spent over 20 years in courtrooms, presiding over hundreds of trials, motions, and hearings. She had trained herself to remain composed, detached, efficient. Justice, after all, required clarity. And clarity required distance. But when the bailiff handed her the case file labeled 47B, City of Newbridge vs. Ludacris, something inside her shifted before she even read the name. She didn't know why. A subtle chill danced along her spine as she opened the folder and scanned the page. It wasn't until her eyes fell on the defendant's name that her hand stopped moving, her pen hovering above the paper like it had forgotten its purpose. Ludacris. Staff Sergeant. United States Marines. Her breath caught. A silent gasp, invisible to the courtroom, but heavy to her chest. She stared at the words. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Her eyes trailed across the record: charges, trespassing, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest. The standard write-up from city enforcement. And then, further down, a brief note: former USMC, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Combat veteran. Iraq War. And just below that, a list of commendations. Purple Heart. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Her fingers tightened on the file. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the name, the unit, the dates, everything matched. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears as the world around her dulled to a hum. She stared at the man seated on the bench, slouched in that threadbare military coat, looking small and forgotten. His head hung low, as if trying to fold into himself. And yet, as she looked closer, fragments of memory stirred. That jawline, the set of his shoulders even beneath the weight of time, something about his presence triggered a memory buried deep beneath years of grief. She looked back at the file. Fallujah. April 2004. Ambush during a convoy escort mission. 6 lives saved. Officer extraction under fire. It was all there in official language. But for her, it was more than a report. It was her brother's last letter home. Olivia blinked rapidly, struggling to refocus as the prosecutor launched into his prepared remarks. She heard his words, but they sounded far away, like voices through water. Her mind was unraveling a memory she hadn't touched in 2 decades, a photograph, a smile, a folded flag. Jack. Her brother. Lieutenant Jack Parker. Killed in Iraq just weeks after writing that final letter, the one she had read over and over again, tucked away in a locked drawer, a piece of him preserved in ink. He had written about a man named Ludicrous. A staff sergeant. A Marine who had run into the fire when others couldn't. Who dragged Jack to safety when he was bleeding out. Who refused to leave him behind. If not for him, Jack had written, none of us would have made it out. Olivia had clung to that letter, let it wrap around her like a shield during the funeral, during the years of silence that followed. She had searched for that man once, reached out through military channels, trying to thank him, to hear more about Jack's final moments. But the trail had gone cold. They told her the man had redeployed, then vanished from records. She had given up hope of ever finding him again. And now he was sitting in her courtroom. Shackled. Weathered. Forgotten. The prosecutor's voice sharpened suddenly. This is Mr. Ludicrous's third citation this year. We recommend 30 days community service and a no trespass order for downtown. The words landed like a slap. A no trespass order would bar Ludicrous from the only shelter in the area, the soup kitchens, the church meals. It would effectively sentence him to the streets during the bitterest winter months. Olivia glanced again at the man in the coat, her heart squeezing in her chest. This wasn't justice. This was punishment masquerading as order. She set the file down and laced her fingers together, breathing slowly to keep her face neutral. Mr. Ludicrous, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Do you have legal representation today? He shook his head slowly. No, ma'am. My public defender got pulled into another courtroom. Would you like to speak on your own behalf? He raised his head just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes were tired, but there was still a glint of pride, of dignity not yet extinguished. No excuses, ma'am. Just needed to stay warm. Why that location? His voice was quieter now. Jimmy, the cook. Known him since he was a kid. His daddy served with me in Desert Storm. Leaves food out sometimes. Didn't want to cause trouble. Just needed heat. And your service record? She pressed, barely breathing. He straightened, barely perceptibly. United States Marine Corps. 1975 to 1995. Staff Sergeant. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Iraq. The courtroom had gone still. Even the prosecutor paused, suddenly unsure. Olivia made another note, her hand trembling slightly. She flipped to the final page in the file and stared. It was there. Fallujah. April 17th. The same date etched into her memory. The same operation Jack had written about. Her fingers closed the file with deliberate care. She looked up again at Ludicrous, truly looking now. Beneath the layers of poverty, the grime of the streets, the silence of a forgotten man, there he was. The Marine who had given her family 2 more weeks with her brother. 2 weeks she'd never trade for anything in the world. She could feel the lines on her face tightening, the air thick with unspoken history. She needed time. Time to think, time to confirm what her heart already knew. She rose from the bench with precise formality. This court will recess for 15 minutes, she announced. The gavel tapped once. As she turned and stepped through the side door into her chambers, she didn't notice the surprised murmurs behind her. She didn't see Ludicrous glance up, confused at the sudden pause. Her hands were already pulling open her desk drawer, reaching for the old photograph she hadn't looked at in years. Her and Jack on the day of his commissioning, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them smiling like the world couldn't touch them. And beneath that, the letter. Worn at the edges. Folded carefully. Sacred. Her lips parted as she whispered the name aloud, the name she had never forgotten. Ludicrous. Then she picked up the phone and made the call that would change everything. The courtroom buzzed faintly with the murmur of whispers as the judge stepped away, leaving a silence that pressed against the wood-paneled walls like a held breath. Ludicrous sat in his seat, hands folded together, his cuffed wrists resting gently in his lap. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling as though there might be some message waiting there, something divine or final. He didn't understand why the judge had paused. He had been in courtrooms before. They rarely cared who you were. It was always about what you had done, what you were accused of doing, and never why. But this time felt different. The way she had looked at him, the pause in her voice when she said his name, it was like something cracked in the routine of it all. Then the heavy doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. In stepped a man who didn't belong, not in a place like this. He moved with precision, polished leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. His suit was a deep navy blue, crisp and tailored, with a thin burgundy tie and a silver tie clip that gleamed under the courtroom lights. His salt and pepper hair was combed back, his expression calm but focused. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than anything Ludacris had owned in a decade. The stranger walked directly to the defense table without hesitating, as if he had walked this path 100 times, as if he already knew everyone in the room. He placed the briefcase down, clicked it open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper before glancing at the bailiff. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the empty bench with formality that didn't falter. "Alexander Ross. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Ludacris." The courtroom paused, the statement dangling in the air. Even the prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Ludacris stared at the man beside him, his confusion etched deep into every line on his face. He leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "I didn't hire anyone." "I know," Ross replied, his voice low and even. "But someone did." "I can't pay for this," Ludacris said, his voice rough from years of silence. Ross looked at him, not with pity, but with a quiet kind of gravity. "You won't need to. My firm is representing you pro bono." Ludacris blinked. "Why?" Ross hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Because someone finally looked at your name and remembered what it means." Just then, the door behind the bench opened again and Judge Parker re-entered, her expression unreadable, though something in the set of her mouth suggested a battle had just taken place behind closed doors. She returned to her seat with poise, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at Ross. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Ross. The court wasn't informed of any change in representation." "My apologies, Your Honor," Ross said with a respectful nod. "It was a last-minute development. I respectfully request a brief recess to confer with my client before we proceed." She studied him carefully, her gaze flicking to Ludacris and back again. Her tone remained formal, but her voice had softened by a fraction. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, she said, and with a sharp tap of the gavel, she disappeared into her chambers once more. The moment the room settled, Ross turned to Ludacris with the smooth efficiency of someone used to working under pressure. "We don't have long," he said. "I need to understand what's happened, everything. From the arrest to your background." Ludacris shook his head, still dazed. "Who are you? Why are you here?" "My name is Alexander Ross. I was your brother's law partner, your commanding officer's friend. Judge Parker's late husband, Thomas, was one of the founders of our firm. I've known her since before she wore the robe. And believe me, she doesn't make many phone calls during court recess unless it means something." Ludacris sat back, stunned. "You're here because of her?" "I'm here because you're not supposed to be sitting there in chains," Ross said. "I'm here because people with power have started to realize that forgetting you was a mistake." Ludacris looked away, his jaw tightening. "Too late for that." "Maybe not," Ross said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Tell me what happened at the cafe. From your side." He explained quietly. How Jimmy left out food sometimes. How he never stayed long. How he wasn't trying to cause trouble, just avoid the cold. Ross took notes quickly, his pen moving in precise lines. He already knew most of it from the file but wanted to hear Ludacris say it, to understand how the man in front of him had gotten so far from the Marine who had once saved a convoy in Fallujah. "You served from 1975 to 1995. Ross asked. Yes. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Iraq. Fallujah, 2004. Operation near the western edge of the city. Ludacris nodded. Ambush. Supply convoy got hit. Ross looked up. Did you rescue a wounded officer named Parker? The name landed like a tremor. Ludacris's expression stiffened. Yes, he said slowly. Jack Parker. Young. Brave. Got hit pulling a medic to safety. I got to him, dragged him out, took a couple rounds myself. Thought he made it, but I heard later. He did, Ross interrupted. He made it back to Germany. He wrote home about you. His sister kept those letters. Ludacris turned toward Ross, something in his chest tightening that he hadn't felt in years. His sister. Ross nodded. The judge. Ludacris's breath caught. That's not possible. She was just Olivia back then. Jack's little sister. She went to law school after he died. That trial today. That file she held. It had your name and your record. She put it all together. That's why she called me. Ludacris slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed. He looked at his own hands, as if trying to remember the person who had once carried a bleeding lieutenant through smoke and chaos. She remembered. She never stopped trying to find you, Ross said gently. But the military said you'd been redeployed. Then you disappeared. She searched. She grieved. And today, out of nowhere, you walked into her courtroom. Ludacris rubbed a hand across his face, trying to find balance in the storm of revelation. Ross stood and buttoned his jacket. Get ready, Sergeant. When she comes back in, we're not just asking for dismissal. We're demanding it. And that's just the beginning. And for the first time in years, Ludacris felt something stir in his chest, not just surprise or confusion, but something deeper, older. Hope. Judge Olivia Parker sat alone in her chambers, the door locked behind her and the sounds of the courtroom muffled by the thick oak walls. The folder labeled 47B lay closed on her desk, but its contents still pulsed through her veins like a second heartbeat. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the drawer on her right, the one she rarely opened. It was old and stubborn, the metal scraping against wood as she pulled it out slowly. Inside lay a single photograph, a memory trapped in glossy black and white. It showed a younger version of herself, not yet burdened by grief or justice, standing beside her brother Jack in his freshly pressed marine dress blues. He looked so proud that day, his arm draped around her shoulder, the medal from his commissioning ceremony still pinned to his chest. They were smiling, two kids holding on to a moment that neither of them knew would become sacred. She lifted the photo with both hands, holding it just beneath the light from the desk lamp. Her thumb brushed the edge, where the surface had begun to fray. Her eyes, always so precise and clear in court, blurred slightly. She let herself feel it now, the ache, the sorrow, the confusion that had lived beneath her skin for over 2 decades. She never expected to see the name Ludacris again, not in a courtroom, not in handcuffs, not like this. Her mind drifted back to the last letter Jack had written, the one she had read so many times she could recite it in her sleep. She reached further into the drawer and pulled it out carefully. The envelope had yellowed, and the paper was soft at the folds, but his handwriting remained intact, neat and unwavering. She unfolded it and began to read once more, her lips moving silently with each line. Dear Olivia, it began, I know you worry. I can almost hear your voice every time I step outside the wire. But today I need to tell you about someone. His name is Ludacris. Staff Sergeant. He saved my life, Liv. No exaggeration. We got hit on a convoy near the western edge. Everything went to hell. I was pulling a medic to safety when I got tagged in the shoulder. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Everyone else was pinned down. Then I saw him, Ludacris, charging through fire like it was nothing. He pulled me up, dragged me through a gauntlet of bullets, and never once hesitated. When I told him to leave me, to help the others, he said, "Not on my watch, Lieutenant." He stayed. He fought. He covered our retreat. If not for him, I wouldn't be writing this. Olivia pressed her hand over the letter, her breathing shallow. She remembered reading that paragraph for the first time at the kitchen table, just days before the knock came at the door. Just days before the folded flag. Just days before the silence that never truly left. After Jack died, she had begged the Marines for information. She wanted to find Ludacris, to thank him, to hold on to any part of her brother's final hours. But they told her he had redeployed. Later, the answer changed. They said he had been discharged under complicated circumstances, severe PTSD, traumatic brain injury. After that, there was nothing. No forwarding address. No contact. No closure. She had carried the burden of Jack's death quietly, professionally. The black robe had become her armor. Every case she judged was another step toward justice, toward making sure no one else was forgotten. But justice had its blind spots. She had tried to build a system that remembered names, that cared. And yet the man who had saved her brother's life had ended up cold, hungry, and alone, sitting in her courtroom like he didn't matter. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. How many others had they missed? How many soldiers had vanished into alleys and underpasses, ghosts of wars no one wanted to talk about anymore? She clenched her fists, then slowly released them, determined now. She would not let Ludacris disappear again. Not while she had breath in her lungs. Not while she sat on this bench. A knock came at the door, breaking the silence. It was Alexander Ross. She rose and opened the door, letting him in without a word. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His face was calm, but his eyes searched hers with quiet urgency. "It's him, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded and handed him the photo. Ross studied it for a long moment before setting it gently on her desk. "I saw his service record. Silver Star for that day. He never even mentioned it." "He never would," she said. "Jack said he was humble. The kind of man who didn't care for medals, just missions." Ross rubbed the back of his neck. "He's been on the street for years. I talked to him briefly. He lost everything. The system chewed him up and spat him out." Olivia sat again and picked up the letter. "I tried to find him. I wanted to say thank you. I needed to know what Jack's last moments were really like. And now here he is. Sitting in my courtroom. Shackled." Ross pulled a chair closer. "You can recuse yourself. No one would question it." "No," she said firmly. "I'm not stepping aside. This isn't just a case anymore. This is a debt. A wound. A chance to finally do what should have been done 20 years ago." "There are risks," Ross said carefully. "Ethical ones." "There are ethical obligations too," she replied, lifting her gaze. "Especially to those who gave everything for this country." Ross fell silent, his respect for her deepening. She gathered the photo and letter and slid them back into the drawer, this time with purpose. She straightened her robe, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the clock. 15 minutes are up," she said. "Time to go back in." Ross stood beside her. "What will you do?" "I'll do what justice demands," she said. "And I'll start by making sure the world remembers who Ludacris really is." As they left the chamber and returned to the bench, the air in the courtroom felt different. Thicker, heavier, filled with anticipation. Olivia took her seat, calm and composed on the outside, but with a fire rekindled within. She looked down at Ludacris and, for the first time, truly saw him, not as a defendant, not as a burden, but as a man who had once carried her brother through the fire. And now, after all these years, she would carry him forward. When Judge Olivia Parker stepped back into the courtroom, the change in her was imperceptible to most. She moved with the same composed stride, her black robe flowing gently around her as she took her place behind the bench. But for those who knew her best, her clerk, the bailiff, and certainly Alexander Ross, there was a quiet gravity to her presence that hadn't been there before. The air in the courtroom, once cold and clinical, now held a tension that buzzed beneath every breath. Ludacris sat motionless at the defense table, still unsure how a courtroom that had once felt like another battlefield had suddenly begun to shift around him. The walls weren't closing in anymore. They were listening. "Mr. Ross," Olivia said, her voice clear, "has your client made a decision regarding representation?" Ross stood confidently, buttoning his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Ludacris wishes to proceed with our firm's representation, and with the court's permission, we ask to proceed with a motion for dismissal of all charges." The prosecutor, young and sharp as ever, moved to object, but Olivia raised her hand. "We'll get there. First, I have a few questions for the defendant." She turned her gaze on Ludacris, but this time her voice was gentler. "Mr. Ludacris, your military file lists your service with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines in Iraq. Is that correct?" Ludacris nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Served from 1975 to 1995. Deployed again in 2004, Fallujah." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "Were you present on April 17 during a convoy operation on the western edge of the city?" Ludacris's eyes narrowed, the date crawling back into his mind like a ghost unburied. "Yes, ma'am. We were escorting supplies. Ambush hit us hard. Lost our lead vehicle. Took fire from rooftops and alleys. During that engagement," she continued, her tone unreadable, "did you evacuate a wounded officer by the name of Lieutenant Jack Parker?" The courtroom fell into silence. Ludacris's lips parted, but no sound came out. He blinked, trying to anchor himself in the moment, as the past surged forward in sharp, brutal images. The officer's voice screaming orders, the blood on his arm, the desperate weight of dragging him through dust and gunfire. "Yes," he finally said, voice hushed. "I remember that name. Parker. Young lieutenant. Took a hit while pulling a medic out of the open." He paused, lost in the memory, then continued. "I got to him. Pulled him behind cover. He kept yelling at me to leave him, to help the others. But I told him, not on my watch. We got him on the bird to Germany. But later I heard his convoy hit an IED. I always wondered if saving him only delayed the inevitable." From the gallery, a rustling sound broke the tension as a silver-haired man in a Marine League jacket stood abruptly. His voice rang out, steady and sure. "That's him," he said, pointing at Ludacris. "That's Staff Sergeant Ludacris. I was there. He saved 6 of us that day." The prosecutor stood again, flustered. "Your Honor, while Mr. Ludacris's military service is commendable, it's not relevant to these charges." "It is deeply relevant," Olivia interrupted, her voice firm for the first time since returning. She set her gavel down but didn't strike it. "And this court will recess for 10 minutes. As the room began to stir, Olivia stood. But instead of walking immediately into her chambers, she did something rare. She paused. Her eyes found Ludacris's, and for the first time, they truly met, not through a pain of power and position, but as two people bound by something deeper. "Mr. Ludacris," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "when I return, there are matters far beyond this case that we need to discuss." Ludacris said nothing, but his eyes widened slightly. He had no idea what she meant. Only that her voice no longer carried the cold tone of judgment. It carried something like recognition. Olivia stepped into her chambers and closed the door, her hands trembling. She moved quickly to her desk, reaching for her phone with practiced urgency. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before dialing a number she hadn't used in years. A voice answered on the other end. Colonel Matthews. This is Olivia Parker, she said, her voice tight. We haven't spoken since the funeral. I need a favor. There was a pause, then a shift in the colonel's tone. What kind of favor? I have someone in my courtroom, she said. Staff Sergeant Ludacris. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He pulled my brother out of the fire in Fallujah. And now he's here, charged with trespassing because he was trying not to freeze to death behind a restaurant. The colonel exhaled. We've been trying to find Ludacris for years. His name came up in the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. His records were flagged for upgrade review. But we lost track of him. Well, I found him, Olivia said. He's sitting in chains. In my courtroom. I need him cleared. I need his file corrected. I need him seen. The colonel's voice was already moving into action. I'll be there in 10 minutes. And I won't come alone. She hung up the phone and closed her eyes, heart racing. For the first time in decades, she felt like she was holding something sacred again. Like she was protecting the brother she lost, not just through grief, but through justice. She composed herself, adjusted her robe, and walked back into the courtroom. And when she entered, she wasn't alone. 3 Marines followed behind her, an active duty colonel, a master sergeant, and a young corporal carrying a polished wooden case. The sound of their boots on the floor caused the entire room to fall into stunned silence. Veterans in the gallery stood on instinct, even the prosecutor froze in mid-motion. Ludacris, still seated, turned to see the uniforms. His body responded before his mind caught up. He rose slowly, stiff but instinctively erect, his spine straightening as though time reversed itself by sheer force of will. His eyes locked onto the colonel's. Judge Olivia Parker returned to the bench, but she didn't sit. She turned to face the gallery, to face Ludacris, to face the truth. Before we proceed, she said, her voice resolute, I must share a personal connection to this case. And as she spoke the name of her brother, as she told the story that had haunted her for 2 decades, Ludacris stood in stillness, watching a world that had forgotten him finally remember. The room had transformed into something more sacred than a courtroom. The usual detachment, the gray rhythm of legal procedure, was gone. In its place stood something raw and reverent, like a cathedral of justice long overdue. Ludacris stood at full height now, his hands still cuffed but his posture speaking volumes. The years had not stolen all his strength. Some parts, the ones forged in combat and duty, remained untouched. Judge Olivia Parker stood before the bench, her voice steady but her eyes moist with memory. The gallery was silent. Even the prosecutors didn't dare shuffle papers. The Marines who entered with her stood at parade rest. Every moment crackled with electricity. My brother, Olivia said clearly, was Lieutenant Jack Parker, United States Marine Corps. In his last letter to our family, he wrote about a Marine who saved his life during an ambush in Fallujah. That Marine was Staff Sergeant Ludacris. Until today, I didn't know what had become of him. Gasps murmured through the courtroom. Ludacris blinked hard, the name hitting him again. He had saved many men during his deployments, but he never forgot the ones who stayed with him, the ones whose fates haunted him in moments of silence. Jack Parker had been one of those. Brave, young, already trying to carry more than his rank required. Ludacris remembered the look in Jack's eyes as he bled through the dust, telling him to leave. And Ludacris, without hesitation, had lifted him onto his back, muttering the words that still echoed today, "Not on my watch, Lieutenant." Olivia continued. 2 weeks after Jack was rescued, his convoy was struck by an IED. He was killed in action. At his funeral, Marines came to tell us how he died. But one of them said something I never forgot. He said, "Your brother saved me." But it was the staff sergeant who carried him that made it possible. He never finished the story. He didn't need to. I looked for that man. But the trail ended in silence. Until today. She turned now, facing Ludacris fully. Mr. Ludacris, I believe you are that man. And I believe justice has failed you. Not just today, not just with these charges, but for years. You gave everything and received nothing in return but silence. Ludacris tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Something inside him had begun to break, something not painful, but long held in check. He had stood on battlefields with explosions ringing in his ears and never flinched, but now he felt his knees weaken at the sound of her voice. Her brother had died. But she didn't look at him with blame. She looked at him with gratitude. The older Marine in the gallery, who had spoken earlier, stepped forward again. I was there too, he said loudly. I saw it. Staff Sergeant Ludacris took rounds in both legs and still carried Jack Parker through a corridor of bullets. 6 of us made it out because he stayed behind and gave cover fire. Olivia nodded at him respectfully, then turned to the colonel beside her. Colonel Matthews, she said, you have something for the court. The colonel stepped forward, posture rigid, voice clear. Yes, Your Honor. After being contacted earlier today, I reviewed Staff Sergeant Ludacris's service file. Under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative, we've been reviewing previously classified engagements for proper commendation updates. Ludacris's actions in Fallujah were understated due to the secrecy of the mission and the chaos surrounding it. After reviewing eyewitness testimony and mission logs, we've determined his original Silver Star was insufficient recognition. The young corporal stepped forward and opened the polished wooden case. Inside lay a medal resting on blue velvet, gold, adorned with a white 5-pointed star over an anchor. By order of the Secretary of the Navy, the colonel announced, in recognition of extraordinary bravery on April 17, 2004, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Ludacris, United States Marine Corps. There was no applause. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because the moment required something deeper than clapping. The silence itself was reverent. Even the prosecutor had lowered his head slightly. Ludacris stared at the medal like it belonged to someone else. His lips trembled. There must be some mistake, he said hoarsely. I didn't do anything special. I just did my job. The colonel's eyes met his with the certainty of a fellow warrior. No mistake, Sergeant. And this is long overdue. A voice rang out from the gallery, crisp and commanding. Attention on deck. The older Marines stood immediately. Veterans, former officers, even some civilians who understood the weight of sacrifice, all stood at attention. One by one, they began to salute. Not out of obligation, but out of deep, soul-born respect. The room rose as if guided by a single force. Judge Parker stepped down from the bench and walked slowly toward Ludacris. The gavel rested behind her, forgotten. She stood face to face with the man who had once saved her brother and, by extension, saved a part of her family's soul. Her voice was softer now, no longer the judge, just a sister speaking for her brother. My brother once told our parents what you said to him that day, she said. He said you looked him in the eye and said, no Marine gets left behind, not while I'm still breathing. Ludacris swallowed hard. She continued. Today, Staff Sergeant Ludacris, we keep that promise to you. Then, for the first time in decades, his hands were unshackled. The cold clink of metal falling away from Ludacris's wrists echoed through the courtroom like the final note in a long-forgotten anthem. The bailiff who removed the cuffs didn't speak. He simply stepped back, his face caught somewhere between humility and awe. Ludacris rubbed his wrists out of habit, but the feeling that spread through him was more than just the return of circulation. It was the return of something buried for years, a feeling he hadn't dared name in a long time. Dignity. The weight of shame had hung on him like that coat he wore every day, heavy with stories no one wanted to hear. But now, in front of a room that stood for him, he began to feel lighter. He looked around, unsure of what to do. The gallery was filled with faces, some familiar, most not, but all of them were watching him differently now. They no longer saw a homeless man in a torn military jacket. They saw the Marine he had once been, the man who ran into enemy fire without hesitation, the man who had held the line while others escaped. For so long, he had been invisible. Now he could feel every eye, not as judgment, but as acknowledgement. That silent recognition meant more to him than medals or money ever could. The older Marine in the gallery, the one who had stood up and confirmed his story, stepped forward slowly. His knees were stiff, but his voice was clear. He walked until he stood directly in front of Ludacris, then came to attention and raised his hand in a sharp salute. Ludacris hesitated for a heartbeat, then returned it. The older man's voice was low, filled with emotion. "You probably don't remember me. I was the radio operator that day. You covered me while I pulled the rest back. You took a bullet that was meant for me." Ludacris squinted at him, the memory unfolding like an old photo from the war. "Harris," he said quietly. "Lance Corporal." Harris smiled through damp eyes. "I never forgot. I just didn't know where to find you. I've been telling people for years about that day. They thought I was exaggerating. They didn't believe anyone could have done what you did. I told them you weren't just a Marine. You were the reason half of us made it home." Ludacris gave a small nod, overcome. He had forgotten what it felt like to be remembered, to be seen not as a problem but as a protector. Ross stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Ludacris's shoulder. "This is only the beginning. The Navy Cross is just one part. There are records to correct. Benefits that were denied. A life that needs rebuilding." Judge Parker, still standing near the bench, cleared her throat. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Ludacris, this court formally dismisses all charges against you. Permanently. You are free to go. But before you leave, there's one more matter we need to address." She motioned to the master sergeant, who stepped forward with a tablet in hand. He tapped the screen, confirming the data, then handed it to Ross. Ross read it quickly and turned to Ludacris. "Your VA disability rating has just been updated to 100%, service-connected, retroactive to your original discharge date. That means full back pay, full medical coverage, housing assistance, and educational benefits, effective immediately." Ludacris blinked in disbelief. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Ross said, his voice thick with conviction, "that you won't be sleeping behind restaurants anymore. It means no more cold nights. No more being treated like you don't exist. It means your country is finally doing what it should have done a long time ago, taking care of one of its own." The room remained silent, the depth of the moment weighing on every soul present. Then, from the back of the courtroom, another figure stood. A younger man in a white apron, his cheeks flushed with emotion. It was Jimmy, the cook from the Jefferson Street Cafe. His hands trembled as he stepped forward, gripping a small white paper bag. His voice cracked when he spoke. "My dad used to tell me about a Marine who saved his whole unit in Iraq. Said if I ever met a man named Ludacris, I owed him everything." Jimmy looked at him, eyes filled with awe. "I didn't know it was you." "Not until today." Ludacris stared at the young man, stunned. Jimmy continued. "Every time I left a sandwich behind that vent, I did it because of what my dad told me. I never thought I'd get the chance to say thank you." He extended the bag toward Ludacris, and inside was a warm sandwich. Roast beef and cheddar, just like the one he hadn't been able to finish the night he was arrested. Ludacris took it with shaking hands, his throat too tight to speak. The prosecutor approached slowly, looking genuinely remorseful. He removed his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Ludacris, I owe you an apology. I didn't see you. I didn't see your story. I only saw the charges. I'm sorry." Ludacris looked at him for a long moment before offering a small nod. "You did your job. Now I get to start doing mine again." "And what's that?" the prosecutor asked softly. Living, Ludacris replied. The room shifted again, but this time it wasn't silence, it was the soft buzz of hope. People smiled. Some wiped tears. The courtroom, for the first time in many of their lives, had become a place of redemption instead of just resolution. As the final papers were signed and the room began to empty, Judge Parker walked down from the bench. She stopped in front of Ludacris, standing close enough that he could see the sadness behind her strength. My brother never stopped talking about you, she said. He said you were the reason he had the courage to keep going. After he died, I spent years trying to find that courage again. Today, I think I found it. Ludacris swallowed hard. He was a good Marine. Cared about his people. Not many young officers do. He wanted to be like you, Olivia said, her voice a whisper. They stood in silence for a long moment before she reached out and took his hand, not as a judge, not as a woman seeking justice, but as a sister honoring a promise. As Ludacris left the courtroom that day, the wind felt warmer. The sky, brighter. For the first time in years, the weight of the coat on his shoulders felt right again. He wasn't invisible anymore. The veteran had stood. And the world had stood with him. The courtroom had emptied, but Ludacris remained standing in the same spot, motionless, as if rooted to the polished floor. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for decades had begun to lift, but what replaced it was something even heavier in its own way, acknowledgement. For years, he had carried his past alone. Now that the truth had found daylight, it didn't feel like freedom yet. It felt like standing at the edge of a life he never expected to get back. Judge Olivia Parker remained beside him. Her robe seemed less imposing now, like a veil she had set aside in the presence of someone who had once mattered more than her title, more than the law. She looked at him with a quiet steadiness, as if trying to memorize every line in his face, to piece together the man her brother had written about in those final letters from the desert. You said something to Jack, she said, her voice soft. When he was bleeding out, pinned under gunfire. He told us what you said. Ludacris glanced sideways at her, hesitant. You told him, no Marine gets left behind. Not while I'm still breathing. He nodded slowly, the memory blooming vividly in his mind. The sand. The noise. The pressure of Jack's body on his back. The chaos that felt more like instinct than war. That's what we lived by, he said. Didn't matter the rank. Didn't matter the orders. You didn't leave your people behind. Not ever. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line, fighting emotion. Jack believed in that. He believed in you. Ludacris looked down at his hands. They had once been hands that pulled others from wreckage, that stitched wounds with trembling fingers under makeshift tents. Now they looked old and worn, like the rest of him. Sometimes I think I failed him. I saved him that day, but he still died 2 weeks later. Part of me always wondered if I should have let him go. Olivia's eyes flashed. Don't say that. Don't ever say that. He turned to her, startled by her sudden intensity. You gave us 2 more weeks with him, she said, stepping forward. 2 more letters. 2 more phone calls. 2 more chances to hear his voice, to know he was alive. You didn't fail him. You gave us a gift we never could have asked for. Ludacris swallowed hard. He hadn't cried in years. The war had trained him not to. The streets had buried his emotions under survival. But now, something unrelenting was pushing up from deep inside. Jack told our parents you were the kind of Marine he wanted to be, she continued. He said you weren't just a soldier, you were the kind of man who gave people courage just by standing next to them. I was just doing what I was trained to do, Ludacris muttered. No, Olivia said. You were doing what was right. They stood in silence for a long beat, surrounded by the distant echoes of a courtroom that had witnessed something rare that day. When Ludacris finally moved, it was with deliberate slowness. His legs still ached, but there was a strength in his spine now that hadn't been there in years. Ross approached from the side, carrying the tablet still displaying Ludacris's full benefits update. He looked tired but satisfied, like a man who had just won a war no one else had been watching. "You're officially in the VA system again," he said. "Housing, back pay, medical support, it's all happening. You'll have a place to sleep tonight. A real place. No more alleyways." Ludacris nodded, not quite trusting his voice. The idea of a warm bed felt surreal, almost laughable. Ross handed him a folder. "There's one more thing. You'll have to attend an orientation for the housing program, but that's not today. Today, you get to walk out of here with your name restored." Ludacris looked at the folder and then at Olivia. "What made you remember?" "I never forgot," she said. "Not you. Not Jack. I just never thought I'd see you again. But the second you said your name, it hit me. The moment I opened that file, I knew." He took a slow breath. "I didn't want to be found." "And yet," Olivia said with a faint smile, "you came anyway." "I wasn't expecting this," Ludacris said. "I figured I'd plead guilty, serve my time, get back to the alley behind Jimmy's place." "You're not going back there," Ross said. "Ever." Olivia stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on Ludacris's arm. "This country forgets its heroes too easily. But today, we didn't forget. Not you." He looked down at her hand, then back up to her face. "You know, all these years I told myself I didn't need anything. Not a thank you. Not a parade. Not even a bed. I thought if I kept my head down and kept breathing, maybe that was enough." "And was it?" she asked. "No," he whispered. "It wasn't." She nodded slowly. "Then let this be the beginning of something new." The double doors of the courtroom creaked open, and the bailiff gestured toward them. Outside, the late afternoon light was starting to pour in, golden and soft. Ludacris stood there, staring at the threshold, wondering how many years had passed since he last walked out of a building without a number pinned to his chest or a paper telling him where not to go. Before he stepped forward, Olivia said, "There's one more thing I want you to hear. Something my brother said in his last letter. He wrote, 'Ludacris told me no Marine gets left behind.' I believe him. And if I ever have to lead men into fire, I'll carry that promise with me." Ludacris closed his eyes. His jaw clenched. That memory alone was worth everything. "You didn't just keep your promise," Olivia said. "You taught Jack how to make one of his own." Ludacris looked at her, his voice raspy but resolute. "I kept it because someone had to. That's all I ever knew." "You did more than keep it," Olivia said. "You lived it." And with that, Ludacris took his first steps toward the light. Colonel James Matthews sat at his desk at the Regional Base Command Center, his attention buried beneath a stack of case reviews and military evaluations when his phone buzzed. He had learned long ago to ignore most interruptions during paperwork hours, but something about the number flashing on the screen froze him. It was a secure line, one reserved for high-level communications or personal emergencies. When he saw the name, Judge Olivia Parker, his pulse quickened. It had been years since they'd spoken, since her brother's funeral, in fact. He hadn't forgotten Jack Parker. No one who had served with the young lieutenant could. And he certainly hadn't forgotten the man who had saved him, Staff Sergeant Ludacris. He picked up the receiver slowly, his voice composed but curious. "Colonel Matthews." "James," came the quiet voice on the other end, heavy with the kind of emotion he only heard in survivors. "It's Olivia." He leaned back in his chair. "Olivia. I haven't heard from you since, well, since we folded the flag for Jack. Are you all right?" "I need a favor," she said. "Something urgent." He sat up straighter. "Say the word." "I have a man in my courtroom," she continued. "His name is Ludacris. Staff Sergeant. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He's being charged for trespassing behind a cafe. But I believe he's the same man who carried my brother out of the ambush in Fallujah. Matthews felt his throat tighten. The name struck him like a jolt from the past. Ludicrous, he repeated slowly. That man's a legend. We thought he disappeared. So did I, Olivia whispered. Until he walked into my courtroom in cuffs. There was silence on the line for several moments as Matthews absorbed what he'd just heard. He turned slowly to a nearby cabinet and pulled out a file marked with a bright red tag. It was part of the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative, a comprehensive effort to correct records and benefits for combat veterans whose service hadn't been fully acknowledged due to outdated classification or administrative neglect. Ludicrous's name had been among the top 5 on the priority list. For weeks they had tried to locate him, only to find records lost, addresses outdated, and benefits unclaimed. Do you have confirmation? Matthews asked. Are we sure it's him? I'm sure, Olivia said. He confirmed the date. The unit. He remembered Jack. Recounted the entire ambush. Matthews stood now, energized. I need 10 minutes. I'll be there in full uniform. And I'm not coming alone. As soon as the call ended, Matthews moved like a man on a mission. He grabbed his dress blues, slipping into them with the speed and precision of habit. He summoned a master sergeant and a young corporal from down the hall and gave them direct instructions. You're with me. We're going to Newbridge Courthouse. We're honoring a Marine. The corporal hesitated. Sir, what's happening? Matthews turned to him, eyes fierce. We're correcting history. Within 7 minutes, they were in a government vehicle heading downtown. Matthews sat in silence for most of the drive, his hands resting over a ceremonial wooden case that the corporal held gently on his lap. Inside it lay the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for valor in combat. He had requested it weeks ago after confirming Ludicrous's actions through field reports and declassified mission logs. The Silver Star Ludicrous had received had been an insult to the reality of what he had done. Matthews had pushed hard for the upgrade. But until now, there had been no one to present it to. As they neared the courthouse, Matthews reflected on the legacy of Marines like Ludicrous. Men who never asked for recognition, who returned home only to face unemployment, trauma, broken systems, and society's blind eye. Ludicrous hadn't just fought in Fallujah. He had survived it. Then he had survived homelessness, loneliness, and decades of erasure. Matthews clenched his jaw. Today was going to be different. When they arrived, the security officers at the courthouse barely had time to stand before Matthews flashed his credentials and swept through the building. The courtroom doors opened just as Judge Parker had returned to the bench, and the entire room turned in stunned silence to see 3 uniformed Marines walk in, a colonel leading the way, his chest decorated with commendations. Behind him, the young corporal carried the polished box with reverence. Ludicrous turned at the sound of boots. His eyes widened. Muscle memory kicked in before he could think, his back straightened, his chin lifted. He didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct in his body recognized the moment. It wasn't ceremony. It was brotherhood. Colonel Matthews approached the bench, nodded respectfully at Olivia, then turned to the courtroom. Your Honor, I believe I speak for the Department of the Navy when I say this day is long overdue. He turned now to Ludicrous. Staff Sergeant Ludicrous. You don't know me. But I've known your name since the day we pulled the last survivors from that convoy in Fallujah. I've read every line of every report. You didn't just save a young officer. You saved a mission. And you changed lives. The corporal stepped forward and opened the case, revealing the Navy Cross nestled in velvet. Matthews continued. By order of the Secretary of the Navy, and under the authority of the United States Marine Corps, the Silver Star previously awarded to Staff Sergeant Ludicrous is hereby upgraded. In recognition of extraordinary heroism in combat, the Navy Cross is now presented to you, sir. Ludacris stared at the medal, unmoving. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. His hands, calloused and bruised from years on the street, shook as he reached out. For a moment, he hesitated. As if afraid that by touching it, it might vanish. Then, slowly, he closed his fingers around the medal. There were no cheers. No applause. Only silence, and the soft rustling of fabric as veterans and servicemen in the gallery stood to attention. Ludacris turned to them, and the room stood with him. He had faced death and come back. Faced abandonment and endured. Today, the nation that had forgotten him was remembering at last. He was no longer the man behind the cafe. He was Staff Sergeant Ludacris once again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The silence that blanketed the courtroom after the presentation of the Navy Cross was unlike anything Ludacris had ever experienced. It wasn't the sterile hush of legal decorum, nor the uneasy quiet of anticipation before a verdict. It was reverent, sacred, the kind of silence one hears before the hymn begins or after a life-altering truth is spoken. The medal felt heavy in his hands, not because of its physical weight, but because it carried the recognition he had long ago stopped expecting. For years, he had walked unseen through the streets, a man mistaken for his worst day. Now, in front of Marines and civilians alike, he was being honored for his finest. Judge Olivia Parker hadn't spoken since the award was announced. She remained still behind the bench, her gaze locked on Ludacris, though her hands trembled slightly on the gavel. She had watched the moment unfold with the same awe as everyone else, but beneath her professional control, emotion stirred fiercely. The man standing before her, in a coat worn by time and hardship, had once carried her brother through hell. And now he stood again, not bent by grief or shame, but recognized as the hero he had always been. Colonel Matthews gave a small nod to the master sergeant, who turned to Ludacris and saluted with sharp, crisp formality. Without hesitation, Ludacris returned it. The movement stirred something in the room, a ripple of respect that drew the remaining veterans in the gallery to their feet. Slowly, and with great care, the master sergeant reached into a second folder and handed Ross another document. Ross glanced at it, then turned to Ludacris. This is your official notification of reinstated veteran status. It confirms your honorable discharge, your updated combat commendation, and the full restoration of your benefits package, effective immediately. Housing. Medical. Education. Everything that was lost will now be returned. Ludacris blinked slowly, trying to absorb the words. The courtroom around him faded slightly, his mind wrestling with the scale of what was happening. For so long, he had fought to survive each day. A warm meal, a safe corner, a few hours of rest without fear. He hadn't dared imagine anything beyond the moment. Now he was being told that the past would be repaired, the future reopened. Ross handed him the papers gently. You don't have to do this alone anymore. The young corporal stepped forward next, his boots echoing against the floor with careful precision. He was barely out of training, his face smooth, his eyes wide but respectful. In his hands, he held a folder marked with the Department of Veterans Affairs seal. Sir, he said, addressing Ludacris directly, this contains your housing assignment. You've been accepted into the Patriot Home program for senior veterans. It's a full-service facility designed for dignity, privacy, and community. You'll have your own apartment, access to on-site medical care, and a veteran liaison to help you transition. Ludacris took the folder, his fingers running over the smooth surface like it was something sacred. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. I never asked for any of this. The corporal responded softly. That's why you deserve it. Judge Parker stood then, stepping down from the bench with slow, measured steps. When she reached Ludacris, she didn't look at the papers or the medal. She looked at him, at the tired but unbroken soul behind his eyes. "You didn't ask," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we failed you by not offering it sooner. You carried this nation on your back, and when you came home, we let you fall." Ludacris shook his head. "I made my choices." "So did we," she replied. "And now we're making a better one." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the room. The gallery was no longer a passive audience. It had become a witness to restoration, to something rare in a world too often content with silence. Matthews stepped forward again, motioning to the young corporal. "We've arranged transport. When you're ready, we'll take you to the facility." Ludacris hesitated, his gaze sweeping the room. "I'll go," he said quietly, "but not because I want a soft bed or free medicine. I'll go because someone remembered my name." At those words, something shifted in the room again. Olivia looked down, blinking fast to hold back tears. Ross looked away, jaw clenched. Even Matthews, the grizzled colonel who had stood through countless ceremonies, seemed to exhale more slowly than before. As Ludacris gathered the folders and the medal, Jimmy, the cook from the cafe, stepped forward hesitantly. He held out a small envelope. "I know this ain't much," Jimmy said, "but my dad wrote something years ago about the man who saved his squad. Said if I ever met him, I should give this to him." Ludacris opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased and yellowed. It showed a younger version of Jimmy's father, Private First Class Ronnie Alvarez, smiling awkwardly in desert camo with a group of exhausted Marines. In the corner stood Ludacris, expression serious but eyes unmistakable. On the back, in shaky handwriting, it said, "The man who didn't run." Ludacris closed his eyes for a moment and let the years crash over him. Then he looked up and nodded. "Tell your father, thank you. For remembering." Jimmy's voice cracked. He never forgot. Not for one day. As the three Marines guided Ludacris toward the courthouse exit, the room didn't return to business as usual. It remained still, transformed. Outside, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows down the courthouse steps. For once, Ludacris didn't shy away from the light. He walked into it, flanked by 2 generations of Marines, each step pulling him farther from the silence that had once tried to bury him. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, Ludacris wasn't leaving a place that had forgotten him. He was walking into a future that finally remembered. The apartment was modest but clean, nestled in the heart of a quiet veteran housing community framed by wide sidewalks and neatly trimmed hedges. Ludacris stood inside the doorway, still gripping the set of keys the young corporal had handed him. The door clicked shut behind him with a soft thud, and for a moment he just stood there, listening to the silence. It wasn't the suffocating kind that haunted the alleys and underpasses. This was a different silence, peaceful, unfamiliar, and almost too gentle to trust. The room smelled of fresh paint and pine cleaner, and the windows let in warm afternoon sunlight that painted golden rectangles on the hardwood floor. He took a slow step forward, eyes moving over the furniture that had been placed for him, a simple couch, a sturdy wooden table, a small kitchenette with a new microwave still wrapped in protective plastic. On the far wall stood a narrow bookshelf already stocked with reading materials on veteran rights, health benefits, and something called Reconnecting with Civilian Life. He gave a quiet, dry chuckle. Reconnecting was too soft a word for trying to stitch together a soul after years of exile. Then his eyes landed on a plain cardboard box sitting neatly on the coffee table. It had his name handwritten on top, along with a small seal from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Ross had mentioned something about recovering a few personal effects from storage, but Ludacris hadn't paid much attention. Now, the box looked like a time capsule daring him to open it. He sat down carefully, knees creaking with the stiffness that came from years of sleeping on concrete, and slid the box toward him. He opened the flaps slowly and stared inside. The first thing he saw was a faded photograph of his old squad, taken long before Fallujah, when they were still laughing, still whole. He recognized himself in the middle row, broad-shouldered, eyes bright, one arm slung around a buddy who hadn't made it out of Kandahar. Beneath the photo was a worn leather wallet he hadn't seen in over a decade. He picked it up and opened it. Inside was a $1 bill and a folded bus ticket to Memphis, the city he'd planned to visit before everything went sideways. But what brought him still was the black velvet box nestled at the bottom. It was smaller than the one carrying his new Navy Cross, older, more worn. He pulled it out gently and opened it. Inside, resting against crushed fabric that had once been royal blue, was the original Silver Star medal. It still gleamed, though the ribbon had faded. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb brushing over the raised star. This medal had been awarded quietly, mailed to his last known address with a short letter and no ceremony. There had been no speech, no witness, no honor guard. He had received it while sitting on the edge of a cot in a shared rehab facility, the envelope already torn open when it arrived. He had tucked the box away and never spoken of it again. It didn't feel real back then. Just another ghost from a life he no longer recognized. He set the box down next to the Navy Cross and stared at them side by side. One represented the past as it was. The other, the past finally recognized. He wasn't sure which one felt more true. Then he reached further into the cardboard box and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside was the dog tag he thought he'd lost. Ludicrous, S.SGT. USMC. Blood type. Serial number. He held it between his fingers, the cool metal anchoring him in something that words and papers never could. It had once hung over his chest like a shield. Now it looked like a relic of a man the world had almost buried. He heard a knock at the door. He wasn't used to visitors, so he hesitated before standing and walking across the room. When he opened the door, Olivia Parker stood there, not in robes, not as a judge, but as herself. She wore a navy blue blazer and carried a small wooden box in her hands. Her eyes softened when she saw him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "May I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. "Yeah. Of course." She walked in and looked around, nodding approvingly. "It's simple, but they did a good job. Warm lighting. Peaceful. You deserve more, but it's a start." He gestured to the couch. "Sit if you'd like." She did, setting the box in her lap. "I brought something. Something personal. I found it in a drawer after you left the courtroom. I think it belongs with you now." She opened the lid of the box and revealed a stack of letters bound by a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed with time, but the handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, precise, and full of life. Ludicrous felt his breath catch in his chest. "They're Jack's letters," she said quietly. "He wrote to us often while he was deployed. We saved every one. He mentioned you more than once." She handed him the top letter, and he unfolded it slowly. The ink hadn't smudged. Jack's voice lived in those lines. He read aloud softly. "Mom, Dad, Olivia, yesterday something happened I'll never forget. We were ambushed on a convoy. It was bad. Real bad. I got hit trying to pull our medic to cover. Couldn't move. I thought it was over. But then Ludicrous came through the gunfire like it was nothing. He didn't hesitate. Carried me like I weighed nothing. Covered our retreat. I told him to leave me, and he just said, 'Not on my watch.' He's the kind of Marine I want to be. If I ever make it out of this place, it'll be because of him." Ludicrous stopped reading, his hands trembling. Olivia reached over and placed her hand on his. "He never stopped believing in you. Neither did I." He nodded, unable to find the words. Then he looked back at the two medals on the table. One given and forgotten. One earned again, and finally remembered. "No Marine gets left behind," he said, voice low but firm. Not even the ones the world tries to forget. And in that quiet apartment, under the afternoon sun, Staff Sergeant Ludacris finally felt whole again, not because he'd been awarded a new medal, but because someone had reached into the past, pulled him from the rubble, and said what he had waited so long to hear. We didn't forget. The sun had dipped beneath the tree line outside, casting long golden shadows across Ludacris's apartment as Olivia Parker closed the box of letters and rested her hands gently on top of it. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer awkward or strained, but comfortable, like two old soldiers standing guard over a memory. Outside the window, a breeze rustled the leaves and carried with it the distant sounds of traffic and life moving on. But inside, everything was still, centered around something deeper than time, a moment neither one of them had ever thought they would live to see. Ludacris sat forward on the edge of his couch, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the medals laid out before him. The old Silver Star. The freshly awarded Navy Cross. Each told a part of the truth, but only together did they speak of the full journey. His fingertips brushed the cool metal again, almost reverently, as if trying to determine whether it all was real or some elaborate dream he'd wake up from, back on the sidewalk, back behind the cafe, shivering and forgotten. It's strange, he said finally, voice low. This metal. This apartment. The warmth. People looking me in the eye. I got so used to being invisible that now, even the good feels sharp. Olivia nodded, her eyes glistening. That's because it is. Justice, when it finally arrives, never comes quietly. It breaks into your life and makes you feel everything at once, the pain, the memory, the weight, and yes, even the peace. Ludacris let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. For the longest time, I thought the war was the hardest part. But it wasn't. Coming home was. Learning to live in a world that moved on without you. People said thank you for your service and kept walking. They didn't want to hear about the nightmares or the silence or how it felt to watch your brothers disappear one by one. She looked at him, her own memories flickering across her face. We do that, you know. Civilians. We wrap your service in a flag, place it on a shelf, and call it honor. But the real honor is in remembering. In seeing the man behind the medals. He turned to her. You did. You saw me. I saw Jack in your eyes, she whispered. I saw the promise you made him. No Marine left behind. I carried that sentence like a vow. And when you walked into my courtroom, I realized something. That promise, Jack lived by it. And now, it was my turn. Ludacris rubbed a hand over his face, as if trying to wake himself fully. You did more than that. You reached into a world that doesn't usually listen. You made them hear me. She smiled faintly. You were always worth hearing. The silence wasn't your fault. There was a knock at the door, and Ludacris stood to answer it. A delivery man handed him a plain envelope and saluted before disappearing down the hallway. Ludacris returned to the couch, sat, and opened the envelope. Inside was a formal statement from the Office of Military Records confirming his corrected service history, the new Navy Cross listing, and an official government apology for systemic oversight and failure to recognize and support decorated combat veterans. Ludacris handed the letter to Olivia. She read it slowly, then handed it back. They may never say it out loud, but this is an admission of guilt. I'm not angry anymore, Ludacris said quietly. I was. For years. But now I just want to live. To rest without worrying about what corner I'll freeze in. To remember without guilt. To speak without shame. That's justice, she said, her voice cracking. Not just clearing charges, not just medals. It's giving someone their life back. Her tears finally fell, quiet and unhidden. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall for her brother, for Ludacris, for the countless others who never got their moment in a courtroom full of standing people. Ludacris reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Jack would be proud of you," he said. "He'd say you kept the promise better than any of us could." She smiled through tears. "You kept it first." Outside, the breeze picked up again, and a few leaves tapped against the windowpane. Ludacris stood and walked to the window, looking out over the peaceful courtyard. For the first time in decades, he saw a world he might belong to again. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He had a name again. A story. A future. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to see something like this," he said. "All those nights I thought about disappearing. Fading until no one remembered." "But they do," Olivia said, joining him at the window. "We remember." He looked at her, eyes moist but steady. "You said justice never comes quietly. You were right." It walked into the courtroom wearing dress blues and a wooden box. It spoke in the silence of standing men. And it cried in the voice of a sister who lost her brother. She nodded. "Justice is noisy. But healing. It whispers." They stood in the quiet for several minutes, side by side, both staring into a new world neither had expected. Outside, the sun slipped below the buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. But inside, the light lingered. It stayed in the warmth of the room, in the hum of the heater, in the gentle weight of metals resting side by side, and in the fragile, powerful silence of a man who had finally been seen. And somewhere beyond the years, beyond the battles, beyond the sorrow, Ludacris could almost hear Jack Parker's voice again, laughing, calling out in the wind, saying what he hadn't been able to say in that final letter. "Thank you for not leaving me behind." The morning light seeped through the curtains like a quiet invitation, casting soft golden lines across the floor of Ludacris's new apartment. He stirred from sleep slowly, not jolted awake by the blare of sirens or the sharp cold of a sidewalk, but eased into consciousness by the hum of warmth and the gentle rustle of leaves beyond his window. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he had slept through the night, no adrenaline-fueled starts, no distant memories clawing their way back into his chest. Just rest, whole and uninterrupted. He sat up in bed and stared at the room around him. The dresser across from him had been stocked with clean clothes. The wall above it held a new frame, one Olivia had gifted him the day before. Inside it was the photo of Jack, smiling in his uniform, arms slung proudly around Olivia's shoulders. Beneath the photo were Jack's words, handwritten from one of his letters: "Ludacris didn't just save my life, he reminded me what it meant to lead." Ludacris had read it several times already, and still, each time, it brought a deep, full ache to his chest, the kind that felt less like pain and more like a slow healing. He stood, stretching, his joints creaking but no longer aching with the old weight of despair. There was a mirror above the bathroom sink now, clean and undistorted. He caught his own reflection and paused. For years, he had avoided mirrors. They only reminded him of how far he had fallen. But today, he looked longer. The lines were still there, the gray in his beard untouched, the eyes still weary, but there was a steadiness behind them now, something that hadn't been there before. Recognition. After a quick shower and a change of clothes that fit, that smelled of laundry detergent instead of alley smoke, he stepped out into the hallway. The Patriot Home facility was quiet in the early hours, but here and there, doors opened. Other veterans nodded at him as he passed. Some were older, some younger, all wearing the same invisible badge he carried, the burden of having served and been forgotten, and now, remembered. Downstairs, the common room was beginning to stir with life. Coffee brewed in the corner, filling the air with a warm, inviting scent. A few residents gathered around a television mounted on the wall, watching a morning news segment replaying the scene from the courtroom 2 days earlier. The clip was short but powerful. The moment the colonel awarded the Navy Cross, the courtroom rising to its feet, Olivia Parker's voice steady as she declared all charges dismissed. The headline read, "Forgotten Hero Honored, Homeless Veteran's Story Sparks National Response." Ludacris watched from a distance, heart steady but overwhelmed. One of the younger vets looked over and recognized him. "Hey, that's you, right?" he said, pointing at the screen. "Staff Sergeant Ludacris." Ludacris nodded with a small smile. "Yeah. That's me." The young man stood and offered his hand. "Welcome home, Sergeant. You earned it." He shook it, nodding with quiet gratitude. These weren't empty words. They came from someone who knew. That made them matter more than any speech. After breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of black coffee stronger than he remembered, he sat at a table near the window and opened his new binder. Inside were the documents Ross had helped prepare: enrollment papers for VA medical services, retroactive benefit details, and even information about an adult education program. There was a small pamphlet for a workshop on creative writing, designed specifically for veterans coping with trauma. He smiled faintly at the thought. He had never thought of himself as a writer, but maybe putting the past into words would help free it from his bones. Before he could finish skimming the rest, Olivia entered through the front doors. She wore casual slacks and a soft blue blouse, her hair pulled back, a paper bag in one hand and a familiar warmth in her expression. "I thought you might want something that isn't cafeteria eggs," she said, lifting the bag. He stood, surprised but pleased. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, setting the bag in front of him. "But I wanted to." He opened it and found a fresh sandwich from the Jefferson Street Cafe. Roast beef. Cheddar. Still warm. Jimmy's note was tucked beneath the napkin, "For the man who taught us how to stand up." He stared at it, overcome, then looked at Olivia. "Feels like I'm dreaming." She sat across from him. "If you are, we both are. But this dream's not ending." They ate in companionable silence for a while before she finally said, "The court's been flooded with letters since your hearing. People want to know how they can help. Veterans. Families. Even politicians. Your story hit a nerve. You started something." He swallowed the bite in his mouth and set the sandwich down. "I didn't start anything. I just showed up. Sometimes that's all it takes," she said. "The right person, in the right place, at the right time." He looked out the window, watching two older veterans play a slow game of chess beneath a budding maple tree. "I don't know what comes next. You live," she said. "You tell your story. You take up space. You remind people that honor doesn't fade with age or hardship." He turned back to her, voice thick with quiet wonder. "Is it really that simple?" "No," she said, smiling gently. "But it's possible." Later that afternoon, Ludacris walked outside for the first time since moving in. The sky was vast and blue, the air filled with the scent of new spring grass. He took his time on the path that curved around the courtyard, each step deliberate. He passed a flagpole where the American flag rippled softly in the breeze. He stopped, raised his hand, and saluted, not just the flag, but everything it was supposed to stand for. And in that quiet salute, beneath that wide sky, Staff Sergeant Ludacris felt it, not just restoration, not just recognition, but something stronger. A life, once broken, now mending. A name, once forgotten, now spoken again. And the journey of healing, finally begun. The air inside Ludacris's apartment was warm and still as he sat cross-legged on the floor, a simple cardboard box placed carefully in front of him. It wasn't sealed, wasn't marked with any official agency stamp or badge. Just a plain box that had been dropped off earlier that day with a note from the records office, recovered during storage review. Personal effects, property of Staff Sergeant Ludacris. He hadn't opened it right away. He'd placed it on the floor near the bookshelf, walked past it several times, touched the lid once, then pulled his hand back like it had burned him. Only now, after nightfall and with the hum of the lamp glowing softly in the background, did he sit before it, heart steady but full of old echoes. He slowly peeled back the flaps and reached inside. The first thing he pulled out was a bundle of letters, yellowed and still bound with a fraying rubber band. They were addressed in various handwritings, some from his mother before she passed, others from squad mates whose names he hadn't said out loud in years. As he read through the first few, memories came in waves, not just the words, but the smells, the sounds, the feel of sand beneath his boots in a distant desert where brotherhood meant life and death in equal measure. One letter ended with a phrase that hit him like a hammer: "We keep each other alive by remembering." He set the letters aside, reverently, and reached deeper. His hand brushed against a worn, familiar fabric. He pulled it free and unfolded it slowly. It was his original Marine Corps utility jacket, still stained in places from field work, its patches faded but intact. His name was still there, stitched proudly above the breast, Ludicrous. He held it to his face, breathing in the scent that had somehow survived storage, gun oil, desert wind, and something unmistakably personal. This jacket had shielded him through 2 tours, had wrapped around his shoulders on bitter nights in makeshift tents, had been soaked in sweat, rain, and grief. And yet here it was, waiting quietly like a faithful dog. Beneath the jacket was a small box made of dark wood. He opened it carefully, knowing already what it was. Dog tags. Not his, those he wore again now. These were the tags of friends. Brothers. Men who hadn't come home. He had collected them when possible, promising to one day get them to their families. But war had a way of scattering intentions. And then came the years of wandering, of silence, of being too lost to deliver anything at all. He ran his fingers over the cold metal of each one, whispering names like a prayer. Carter. Mendez. Tucker. Nguyen. Harris. Names that echoed in his bones. Names that deserved more than cardboard boxes and forgotten storage. He sat still for a long while, holding the box in his lap, eyes wet but unblinking. Then he stood and crossed the room to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick notebook, the one he had started a few days ago in the writing workshop for veterans. Most pages were still blank, but the first few were filled with raw, honest recollections. He took a pen, flipped to a new page, and began to write. "Tonight, I held the past in my hands," he wrote. It came in the form of jackets and letters, in names etched in metal. "I used to think memory was a weight. But maybe it's a light too, a way to find the path back." He paused, looking at the photo of Jack Parker on the dresser, then continued. "I couldn't carry them all home. But I carry them now. Every step I take, I walk for them too. Maybe that's what healing is, not forgetting, but honoring." He closed the notebook gently and stood again. There was something he needed to do. He gathered the dog tags carefully, placing them one by one into a soft cloth pouch. Then he retrieved a separate list he had kept since returning, last known addresses, names of family members, churches that had promised to forward letters. It would take time, but he would begin. One by one, he would send them home. And not anonymously. He would write each family, not as a ghost or a shadow, but as Ludicrous, the man who had stood beside their sons and brothers in the final hours. The man who remembered. The next morning, the son found him at the post office. He stood at the counter with the first envelope in hand, addressed to Maria Carter in Texas. The clerk looked at the return label. Patriot Home Veteran Residence. "Yes," Ludicrous said. "It's where I live now." The clerk smiled and nodded, accepting the envelope and placing it gently in the outgoing bin. Ludicrous stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, and for the first time in years, felt something like peace take root inside him, not a loud peace, but a quiet, steady hum that said you're doing right. Later that week, he placed the memory box on a high shelf in his apartment, next to the medals and the framed letter from Jack. It was no longer a symbol of pain. It had become a shrine of sorts, a personal museum of resilience, of lives intertwined, of a journey that no longer needed to hide in the dark. When visitors came, as they often did now, fellow vets, social workers, even students from the nearby college interested in hearing from the Marine who made America stand, he didn't flinch when they asked about the war. He would reach for the box, open it, and let the story unfold, not just of the battles, but of the losses, the silence, the restoration. And with every telling, the past grew lighter. And the future, brighter. Because in that simple cardboard box was the story of a man who had once been forgotten, and now would never be again. The auditorium was quiet except for the soft hum of overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of feet against the polished wooden floor. Students and guests filled the rows, their eyes fixed on the small stage at the front where a single chair, a microphone, and a glass of water waited beneath the spotlight. Ludacris stood behind the curtain, adjusting the collar of his neatly pressed shirt and running a hand over his freshly trimmed beard. He could hear the murmur of anticipation beyond the drapes. This wasn't a courtroom, nor a battlefield. This was something entirely new, a gathering for the Veterans Oral History series hosted by the university's history department. Tonight, the story being told was his. He had been invited by a young professor named Rachel Kim, who had heard about his courtroom redemption and subsequent journey through a mutual friend. She had approached him with the same reverence people usually reserve for historical figures, and he had laughed, gently reminding her that he wasn't a myth, just a man who happened to survive. But she insisted, said students needed to hear from the voices not in textbooks. After some hesitation, Ludacris had agreed. Not because he craved the attention, but because he understood something now. His voice mattered. And if telling his story meant helping someone else crawl out of silence, then it was worth every second of discomfort. A stagehand gave him the nod. He took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The audience clapped, not thunderously, but with genuine welcome. He walked slowly to the chair, sat down, adjusted the mic, and looked out over the faces. Some were young, eyes wide and curious. Others were older, stoic, knowing. And somewhere in the middle sat Olivia Parker, her hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on his with quiet pride. He leaned into the microphone, and for a moment, he just breathed. Then, slowly, he began. My name is Ludacris. Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Retired. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and after I came home, I disappeared. The room was silent, expectant. For years, I lived on the streets. I wore the same jacket I fought in. I ate from garbage bins behind restaurants that had once offered veterans discounts. People passed me every day and didn't see me. I became a ghost in my own country. He paused, letting the words settle. I wasn't always like that. I had brothers. I had purpose. I had the strength to carry men on my back through sandstorms and firefights. But when the war ended, no one gave me a map for what came next. And without that, even the strongest of us can get lost. He shared the story of Jack Parker then. How they had trained together. Fought together. How Jack had saved him more than once with just a word or a steady hand on the shoulder. He described the moment Jack died, how it wasn't a blaze of glory but a quiet bleeding out in the dust, far from home. And how that loss broke something in him he didn't know could break. He didn't cry. Not this time. He told it with the steadiness of someone who had relived it so many times the pain had turned into something softer, like a scar that still tingled but no longer bled. He spoke of the arrest behind the cafe, the trial, the moment Olivia Parker had stood for him, not just as a judge, but as a sister carrying her brother's memory into battle one last time. He told them about the courtroom rising, the Navy Cross pinned to his chest, and the way he had walked out into a world that finally saw him again. I was never looking for medals, he said. I was looking for a reason to matter again. A young man in the front row raised his hand. Ludacris nodded toward him. Did you ever forgive the system that let you fall through the cracks? Ludacris leaned back slightly, considering. Forgiveness is complicated. I don't excuse what happened. I don't forget the cold, or the hunger, or the fear that no one would ever say my name again. But I forgive because I refuse to let bitterness be the last uniform I wear. Another hand shot up. What helped you start over? He smiled faintly. Someone listened. That's all it took. One person who didn't look away. Then another. And then I started listening too, to myself, to the people I'd lost, to the future I thought I didn't deserve. I stopped surviving and started living. As the questions continued, the audience opened up, students spoke of relatives who had served and struggled. A Vietnam veteran near the back wiped his eyes. A woman shared that her father never talked about the war, but she wished he had. And Ludacris kept speaking, not with rehearsed answers but with the raw, honest voice of someone who had lived the truth and come back to tell it. After the session ended, people lined up to thank him. Some shook his hand with reverence. Others asked if he would speak at their school, their community center, their church. He gave each of them the same look, steady, present, real, and said, "If it helps someone, I'll be there." Outside the auditorium, beneath a dark sky pierced by city lights, Olivia walked beside him. They said little at first, just walked down the sidewalk like two friends returning from a shared mission. "You were incredible tonight," she said softly. He chuckled. "I didn't trip over my words." "That's a start." "No," she said, stopping. "You gave people something most don't get these days, truth without armor." He looked at her, eyes reflecting the street lamp glow. "It's strange. For years I felt invisible. And now people listen. You earned that. With every step you took through fire and through silence." He nodded, hands in his pockets, voice quiet. "Then maybe I'll keep walking. Telling the story. For Jack. For all of them." And with that, they kept walking into the night, not as judge and veteran, not as fallen and savior, but as two keepers of memory, two voices refusing to let the past fade quietly. Because now, Ludacris had become something more than a soldier, more than a survivor. He had become a storyteller. And his story had only just begun. The spring sun had risen early, casting long golden rays across the lawn of the veteran cemetery on the outskirts of town. Rows of white headstones stood in solemn formation, each one a silent marker of service, sacrifice, and memory. Among them stood Ludacris, dressed in a modest navy blue suit, his shoes polished and his tie slightly crooked. He stood with his hands folded in front of him, a soft breeze tugging at the hem of his jacket as he stared down at the newly placed headstone bearing the name, Captain Jack Parker, USMC. It had taken months of effort, countless phone calls, requests, and finally a formal petition. But Olivia had worked alongside Ludacris to correct the military records, submit the lost documentation, and push through the paperwork to secure Jack the full honors he had earned. The delay had never been intentional, just another casualty of a broken system. But now, the wrong was being made right. Jack's family had gathered too. His mother, now in her 80s, sat in a wheelchair beneath a small white tent, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the folded American flag presented to her with reverence. Olivia stood beside her, a steady presence, her face unreadable but her eyes glassy with emotion. Ludacris had made the arrangements personally, insisting on every detail, from the Marine Corps bugler playing taps to the 21-gun salute to the small framed photograph placed next to the headstone, Jack and Ludacris, arm in arm, smiling in the desert sun. As the ceremony began, the chaplain spoke briefly of service, duty, and the unbreakable bonds of war. Ludacris barely heard him. His mind was adrift in memory, of Jack's laughter, of whispered jokes in the barracks, of the grim silence of that last patrol, and of the promise made in the dust that day, one he had carried like a stone in his heart for 2 decades. When the chaplain stepped back and the honor guard lifted their rifles, Ludacris stood straighter, his hand rising in a sharp salute as the shots rang out across the open air. Each crack echoed through his bones like thunder, a final farewell stitched with pride. When the flag was placed in Jack's mother's lap, she looked up at Ludacris with eyes that had seen too much and lost too deeply. But in that moment, she smiled. Not broadly, but with a quiet gratitude that spoke volumes. "Thank you for bringing my son home," she whispered. Ludacris crouched beside her, taking her hand gently. "He never left my side," he said. "Not once. I just wanted to make sure the world remembered that." After the ceremony, as the guests trickled away, Ludacris remained. Olivia stood with him beneath the wide sky, both of them silent for a long time. Birds chirped in the distance. A soft breeze passed through the rows of stones like a sigh. "You did it," she said finally. "You brought him full circle." "No," Ludacris replied, his voice deep and low. "We did. You never gave up on him. Or me." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it, he revealed the last of the dog tags, Jack's, recovered and stored by Ludacris all these years. He knelt down and placed them gently at the base of the headstone, brushing the earth with his fingertips. Olivia watched in silence, moved beyond words. Later, they walked back toward the parking lot. But halfway there, Ludacris stopped and turned to look back once more. The sun was higher now, and the white stones glowed with a kind of quiet dignity. "I used to think justice was a gavel or a courtroom," he said. "But I think it's this. Making sure a man's name is spoken with honor. Making sure the people who loved him can look at a grave and know he mattered." Olivia nodded. "And making sure the people who served with him don't fade into silence." He gave a soft laugh, more breath than sound. "You always know the right thing to say." "That's because I listen," she said. "To the silence. To what's missing." They stood there another few minutes before Ludacris pulled open the passenger door of his truck, helping Olivia inside before climbing behind the wheel. As he started the engine, he glanced over at the seat beside him, where a manila folder rested. Inside were the latest letters he had written to the families of his fallen brothers, ready to be mailed that afternoon. The project had grown. Others were helping now, students, historians, even other veterans. It had become more than a personal mission. It was now a movement. As they pulled onto the road, Olivia leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closed. "What are you going to do now?" Ludacris kept his eyes on the road. "Tell more stories. Help others tell theirs. There are so many still hiding in the shadows, afraid they've been forgotten. I want to be the man who finds them. And if no one listens..." He glanced at her, his expression firm. "Then I'll speak louder." She smiled. "You always were good at making people listen." They drove in silence for a while, the wind whipping gently through the open window. The weight in Ludacris's chest had shifted over time. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer dragged him down. It reminded him of who he had loved, who he had lost, and what he still had left to do. The road ahead was no longer empty. It was paved with purpose. As they crossed over a small hill, Ludacris looked in the rearview mirror and saw the cemetery shrinking in the distance. But in his heart, it remained, etched not just in stone, but in the choices he would make from that day forward. The circle had closed. The promise had been kept. And now, it was time to begin again. Rain fell softly on the city sidewalks, casting mirrored reflections of street lamps and storefronts across the pavement. The old neighborhoods buzzed with the usual nighttime rhythm, cars weaving through traffic, sirens in the distance, the occasional clatter of bottles being collected by unseen hands. But within the hum of city life, a new presence moved with quiet purpose. Ludacris walked beneath his dark raincoat, the collar turned up, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, boots steady against the wet concrete. His destination was a modest community center on the east side, a place that had once been a forgotten structure with boarded windows and broken lights. Now, it glowed. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. Warmth greeted him immediately, along with the murmur of conversation and the sharp scent of black coffee. Folding chairs had been arranged in a wide semicircle, each one occupied by a figure hunched slightly forward, listening. The walls, freshly painted by volunteers, held photographs of veterans from every era, young faces in uniform, weathered portraits beside combat medals, grainy snapshots of comrades whose names time had nearly erased. Ludacris walked past them all and made his way to the front, where a small wooden podium stood beneath the humble banner, Voices of Valor, Veterans Sharing Stories to Heal. He nodded at the man seated near the podium, a Vietnam vet named Harold who had become something of a right hand to him in recent months. Harold stood and gave him a soft pat on the shoulder before returning to his seat. Ludacris placed his bag beside the podium and looked out at the circle. These weren't polished speakers. These were men and women still carrying fragments of the battlefield in their hearts. Some were elderly, others still young. Some had never spoken a word of their service aloud. But tonight, they came to listen. And tonight, Ludacris would speak not of medals or trials, but of light. "I want to tell you about a man who taught me what courage really means," he began, his voice steady and full. "Not the kind they write about in news articles. Not the kind that gets you a medal. The kind of courage it takes to remember." He spoke of Jack again, but not of his death. He spoke of how Jack had seen him, not just as a Marine but as a man, a brother, someone worth fighting beside. He talked about the silence that followed, the years spent drifting, the pain of being unseen. Then he told them about the courtroom, the salutes, the judge who had refused to forget her brother. He told them about the first story he wrote, and the first time someone thanked him just for surviving. "I thought the world had moved on," he said. "But I was wrong. Sometimes the world just needs to be reminded." A woman in the second row shifted, lifting her hand slowly. She looked nervous, her eyes wet. "What if you can't tell your story?" she asked softly. "What if it hurts too much?" Ludacris walked toward her, crouched so they were eye to eye. "Then you start with a sentence. A name. A memory. You don't need to say it perfectly. You just need to say it. Pain doesn't grow smaller in silence. It grows heavier. And if you carry it alone long enough, it buries you. But here," he gestured to the room, "we carry each other." Someone began to clap. Others joined. It wasn't raucous, but it was real. And in the midst of that quiet applause, Ludacris saw something shift in the room. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes softened. A few even smiled. After the session ended, people lingered. Stories spilled out slowly, sometimes just a few words, other times an avalanche of memories. Harold shared the day he lost his leg and the friend who carried him through mortar fire. A young man from Afghanistan spoke about the child he couldn't save. A woman named Carla shared how her father came home from Korea and never spoke another full sentence. Ludacris didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix anything. He just listened. And when the evening drew to a close, Ludacris helped fold the chairs, sweep the floors, and lock the doors. Rain had stopped outside. The streets were quieter now, the reflections on the pavement still glowing faintly. As he stepped out, he spotted a familiar figure standing near the curb. Olivia, dressed in a long gray coat, her breath rising in soft puffs in the cool air. "Thought I'd find you here," she said with a small smile. "It's become home, in a strange way," he replied. She handed him a thermos. "Hot cider. You looked like you could use it." He took a sip, warmth spilling through him. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city breathe around them. "You've changed lives here, you know," she said. "Not just your own. Others." "I didn't plan to," he said. "I just couldn't stay quiet anymore." "Well, don't stop now," she said. "There are more listening than you realize." As they turned to walk together down the street, Ludacris glanced up at the darkened sky. The clouds were beginning to break, and through them, faint stars shimmered. He thought about all the men and women whose stories had gone untold, whose memories remained locked behind walls of fear and shame. And he promised himself something, he would keep showing up. Keep speaking. Keep holding the lantern for those still lost in the dark. Because that was the truth he had come to understand. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from shining light into the places we buried long ago. And in doing so, we find our way home, not just alone, but together. The Capitol Rotunda was filled with quiet anticipation. Tall marble pillars stretched toward the dome, where light streamed in through stained glass, casting colored beams across the polished floors. The crowd assembled inside wasn't there for politics or protest. They came for remembrance. And at the center of it all, standing before a microphone flanked by American flags and framed military portraits, was Ludacris. No longer the man who had once wandered the streets unseen, he now stood tall, composed, wearing his full dress uniform for the first time in decades. His chest bore his medals, not as decoration, but as symbols of survival, memory, and resilience. He scanned the crowd. Faces from every part of his journey filled the seats. Olivia Parker sat in the front row, her expression proud and unwavering. Beside her was Jack Parker's mother, holding the same folded flag Ludacris had once placed in her lap. Veterans from the community center filled the side aisles, shoulder to shoulder, some in wheelchairs, others with canes, all wearing their service proudly. Rachel Kim, the professor who had first asked Ludacris to speak at the university, waved gently from a corner seat. He even spotted students who had joined his oral history project, now holding clipboards and cameras, ready to document what would become a national archive of healing and remembrance. Ludacris took a deep breath and stepped closer to the microphone. His voice, though soft at first, carried through the rotunda with quiet authority. "I never thought my name would be spoken in a place like this," he began. "There was a time when even I had forgotten it." The room held still, not even the sound of shifting chairs. "I came home from war and vanished into the streets of this country. For years, I was invisible. A shadow in alleyways. A ghost among the living. But one name brought me back. One name echoed through a courtroom, and everything changed." He paused, the weight of the moment pressing gently on his shoulders. Jack Parker. A quiet rustle moved through the audience, a ripple of acknowledgement. He wasn't just a Marine. He wasn't just a brother. He was the man who saw me when I no longer saw myself. And even in death, his memory lifted me from a place I thought I'd never escape. Ludacris's gaze swept the crowd, locking eyes with familiar faces. But this isn't just about Jack. It's about all of them. Every man and woman who served with honor and came home to silence. Every soul who wandered our streets, forgotten. Every story left untold because no one stopped to ask. This is about names, names that should never be lost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small book, its leather cover worn with use. He opened it slowly. "In this book are the names of men and women I served with. Some are gone. Some are still here, trying to piece their lives together. And I carry their stories, because they are not just memories, they are truths that demand to be heard." He closed the book with reverence. This nation owes them more than a folded flag. It owes them voice, visibility, and dignity. That's why I stand here today. Not because I am a hero. But because I survived long enough to speak for those who can't. Applause rose slowly, beginning with a few hands and growing into a steady rhythm of clapping, not thunderous, but powerful in its unity. Ludacris stepped back slightly, nodding with quiet humility. After the speech, a ceremony followed. A new initiative was announced, the Parker Project, a national program aimed at recording and preserving the oral histories of forgotten veterans. It would be hosted in schools, churches, libraries, and shelters. Every veteran, regardless of rank or status, would have the chance to tell their story, to ensure their name would never vanish again. At the heart of the project would be Ludacris, serving not with weapons or orders, but with words, compassion, and unwavering commitment. When the ceremony concluded, guests lined up to shake his hand, thank him, share pieces of their own stories. Some cried. Others stood in silence, holding his hand for a moment longer than necessary, as if to transfer the weight of unspoken years. Outside, as the sky turned a brilliant shade of blue and gold, Ludacris stepped down the marble stairs of the Capitol. Olivia joined him, her heels clicking softly on the stone. "You did it," she said. He smiled, exhaling slowly. "No," he replied. "We did it." They walked slowly down the path, past statues of generals and presidents, past flags that fluttered in the breeze, toward the parked van that bore the logo of the Parker Project. On its side, painted in clean block letters, were the words, "Every name matters." As they approached, a young boy with a crew cut and oversized backpack tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed at Ludacris. "Mom, that's him. That's the soldier from the storybook we read in class." Ludacris crouched beside the boy and smiled. "I used to be a soldier," he said. "Now I help people remember soldiers." "Why?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "Because when we remember them," Ludacris said, "we remember who we are." The boy nodded solemnly, as if understanding something far beyond his years. That night, Ludacris returned home to his small apartment, the one filled now with light, photographs, and mementos of lives once tucked away in shadow. He sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and began a new entry. "Today, I spoke in the rotunda of the nation. But I wasn't the only one speaking. Jack was there. All of them were there. I heard them in every breath, every word. And I know now, my story is theirs. And theirs is mine." He closed the notebook and looked out the window at the stars blooming across the night sky. Their light, like memory, would never fade. Not as long as one voice remained to speak their names. And Ludacris, once lost, now found, would never let them be forgotten again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?